Imagine this for a second. You're dragged from your home, accused of a crime you can't even comprehend, with absolutely no evidence. They take you to the edge of a cold, dark river, and you can just hear the crowd whispering all around you. Your fate, they tell you, isn't going to be decided by a judge or a jury, but by the water itself. Okay, let's dive right into this really dark chapter of history, the trial by water, a test that was built on a truly chilling equation. This one sentence, it captures the entire terrifying logic of the whole thing. It's just a perfect paradox, a total no-win situation that seems almost designed for maximum cruelty. You see, if you survive by floating, you're guilty and you're condemned. But if you prove you're innocent by sinking, you might just die from drowning. It's this stark, impossible choice that immediately tells you everything you need to know about the horror of these trials.
So what exactly was this thing? Well, it was formerly known as the trial by water, though some people called it the swimming test. It was basically a method they used to figure out if someone was guilty of witchcraft. And while we tend to think of this as something from the really deep, dark Middle Ages, its peak usage actually stretched well into the early modern era, a time of, huge social and religious change.
Now, it is so easy for us to look back on this and just dismiss it as complete irrational madness. But, and this is important, for the people at the time, there was a kind of twisted logic behind it all. They genuinely believed this was a valid test. So the big question is, why? Why on earth would anyone think that pure water could possibly identify a witch? Well, to get the water test, you first have to get the whole idea of the trial by ordeal. See, back in an age where hard evidence was pretty hard to come by, people believed that God or some divine power could step in and make a judgment directly. So they'd set up a painful or dangerous test, and the result, whether a wound healed cleanly or you survived something you shouldn't have, was seen as a direct verdict from heaven. So here's how they applied that idea to the witch test specifically. The thinking went something like this. Number 1, water is a fundamentally pure element. It's used in the sacred ritual of baptism, right? Number 2, a witch, by making a pact with the devil, had spiritually rejected their own baptism. So, number 3, it just made sense to them that this pure holy water would physically reject the impure body of a witch. And this really shows you how they interpreted the two possible outcomes. If you sank, it wasn't just physics to them. It was a sign. The pure water was literally accepting you, embracing you as one of the faithful, one of the innocent. But if you floated, that was seen as something unnatural. The water was actively rejecting your guilty, corrupted body, pushing you to the surface as proof you were in league with evil. So we've talked about the what and the why. But how did this twisted theory actually play out in real life? Well, the practical details of the procedure make this whole thing even more horrifying. The whole process was very methodical, almost like a ritual. First, the accused person was stripped of their clothing. This was to make sure they weren't hiding any charms or objects that could magically help them float. Then, their limbs were often bound, sometimes in a really contorted way, like their right thumb to their left big toe. After that, a rope was tied around their waist, and this is a key detail we're going to come back to, before they were finally lowered, or sometimes just thrown, into the water to await their judgment. Okay, so this brings us to a really common misconception about this whole ordeal. We often hear the line that if you sank, you were innocent, but you drowned anyway. So either way, it was a death sentence. And while the danger was absolutely real, that wasn't always the official plan. Remember that rope I just mentioned? Well, in a lot of the documented cases, that rope was there for a very specific reason, to yank the person out of the water the second they started to sink. The goal was to see if the water would accept them, not necessarily to let them drown. Of course, just imagine the panic. The cold water, your limbs are bound. The risk of accidentally drowning or dying from shock or hypothermia was still incredibly high. This chart just sums up the grim reality of it all. There was simply no good outcome. If you were innocent because you sank, you might survive, but you would be left physically and psychologically scarred for life. And if you were found guilty because you floated, well, you survived the water only to be handed over for interrogation, torture, and almost certainly execution. It was a choice between maybe dying and definitely dying. So you might be wondering, was this just happening everywhere all the time? It's easy to just paint the entire past with one big dark brush, but the water ordeal actually has a pretty specific history. So let's kind of zoom out for a minute and put this on a proper timeline. The idea of a water ordeal actually goes way back, like to the 9th century, and it was used for all kinds of crimes. But here's the crucial part. Its peak usage for witchcraft wasn't in the so-called Dark Ages. It was in the 16th and 17th centuries, the early modern period, right during the height of Europe's massive witch hysteria. It was only toward the late 17th century that a bit of skepticism started to creep in and the practice began to fade away. And this wasn't just some folk practice happening in isolated villages. No, it had support from some very powerful people. King James I of England, yep, the same King James who commissioned the famous version of the Bible, was absolutely obsessed with witchcraft. He even wrote a book about it, and in it he gave his royal stamp of approval to these kinds of supernatural tests, which helped make them seem totally legitimate to the public. And that's another really key point here. In a lot of places, the swimming test was never actually an official state-sanctioned law. Instead, it was often used more informally by local witch hunters and magistrates. It became a tool they could use to basically generate evidence when there wasn't any, all fueled by local panic and paranoia. It was terror from the ground up, not just from the top down. Thankfully, this brutal practice didn't last forever. Like a fever, the witch hysteria eventually started to break. A tide of reason began to rise up against these ordeals, and people started questioning not just their logic, but their morality too.
The criticism started coming from a few different places all at once. You had some theologians who started to say, hey, maybe it's blasphemous to try and force God's hand to perform a miracle just because we demand it. Then you had lawyers who argued it was a completely irrational and unreliable legal test. And critically, you had physicians and early scientists who started offering up natural explanations for why a body might float, things like body fat percentage or air trapped in clothing.
And with all these different voices chipping away at its foundation, the ordeal's credibility just started to crumble. By the late 17th century, this growing wave of skepticism was so strong, but many courts and legal systems began to formally ban the swimming test. It was a slow process, for sure, but it was a definitive victory for reason over superstition. So the ordeal eventually faded into the history books. But it didn't really disappear, did it? It still has this incredibly powerful hold on our collective imagination. So why do we remember this specific test so vividly, out of all the terrible things that happened back then? Well, let's unpack its dark legacy. You have to remember, the water ordeal didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the product of a perfect storm of social conditions. You had this widespread, very real terror of witchcraft and the devil. You had a deep-seated superstition, a belief that the supernatural world was constantly meddling in daily life. And you had a legal system that was struggling with uncertainty, desperate for any method that promised a clear-cut answer. And that's really why it sticks with us. The water ordeal is so much more than just a historical fact. It's a powerful symbol. It represents that terrifying place where faith, fear, and power all collide. It's just a stark reminder of how easily cruelty and irrationality can take over when a society lets fear completely overwhelm reason. And all of this leaves us with one final big question to think about. While we don't use water ordeals anymore, that desire for simple black and white answers, especially when we're confused or afraid, is a pretty timeless human feeling. So, what does the belief in a test like this really tell us about our own tendencies today? Where do we look for certainty when we feel scared? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the trial by water. It is a dark topic, absolutely, but I think understanding these moments from our past is just so important. If you found this explainer interesting or learned something new, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps out. And make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into complex topics just like this one. I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on that final question down in the comments below. See you next time.